Hi and welcome to another narration presented by yours truly, Cryptid Roost. Be sure to check out the blooper reel at the end of the video, which is then followed by the end screen where you will find more videos listed. So grab your coffee, sit back and enjoy the show. And don't forget, where fear is, happiness is not. Banshee Go Braugh. This awesome story is written by MakRalston. Be sure to check out their very own YouTube channel as well as their Creepypasta fandom profile page for more of their stories. Link is below. MakRalston now has a book available at Amazon. It is titled KaMuffins, a horror anthology of just desserts. Be sure to check it out. The Amazon link is below in the description. Happy St. Patrick's Day, everyone! The gent behind the bar hollered, "Sit anywhere you please." But Shannon didn't hear him. Rather, she couldn't hear him. It wasn't called the Clangy Clover for shits and giggles, but a grouping of drunkies on a roaring fire just beneath a windowsill, still being weaved in streaks of rainwater, wasn't the reason why. Shannon couldn't hear at all. She was deaf, but she didn't need to be told to sit anywhere she pleased. She could do that all on her own. "You're a Yank, ain't ya?" The gent behind the bar now wasn't. He was standing beside her at the little booth tucked just beneath the windowsill aside the fireplace. The fire caught her attention with all its crackling and popping like a tiny fireworks show, and she didn't look up at him until the menu and napkins slid across her table. She made a face somewhere between a smile and a grimace and motioned with her hand as if she were writing on invisible paper that was floating in the air. The gent was confused at first, but reached into his apron and pulled out a measly green pen. She nodded fervently, took it, and on one of the napkins scribbled something. She turned it to face him. "I'm deaf." The gent raised two brows and nodded down at her. "Can you read lips?" He said it like a tourist trying to talk to a native outside of their native tongue. Fortunately for him, she nodded. "By the look of the Irish," he said, and he pointed over to the sign labelled "Specials" and smiled. It certainly was a special day for some, that being it was the feast of St. Patrick, March 17th. And the list of the day's options reflected that. Corned beef, cabbage, colcannon, box teas and stew, all of which were typical there. Yet for a Yank from the States, it was just about as festive as having a leprechaun being shoved up your arse. Shannon took a quick glance at the sign and began jotting, and not a moment later the napkin read plainly, "Stew." The gent nodded, but before he could turn around, she grabbed a napkin and wrote something else. "No onions." "We make it in a crock," he said, "so I can't go and give you no onion. Besides, who the feck doesn't like onion in their stew? That's a crock." She smiled up at him and nodded understandingly. "You still want it?" he asked. She made a knocking motion with her hand and nodded alongside it, and the gent meandered into the kitchen. Shannon sat silently, cleared her throat after a sharp cough, and looked around the place. Clearly there was some kind of music playing. She couldn't damn well hear it, but the fella at the booth behind her was tapping his toe pretty hardily in a 6 to 8 time. She smiled. A couple of guys were clinking their pints at the bar, a bearded one shuffling a deck of cards and just behind him a woman danced a soft jig. "Here's that stew," the gent said, setting it just before her at the table. "I tried me damnedest to get a scoop with no onion. Tell me how you like it." She pressed her fingers to her chin and lowered them down at him before lifting the spoon out of the bowl and swallowing a nip. It was nice and warm, much like the place she had found herself in on such a cold, wintry night, and it was rather heavy on the potatoes, yet obviously she expected as much. She grabbed a pen and napkin and wrote again. "It's good. I thought you'd like it." The gent smiled, flashing a set of yellow teeth. "It's me mammy's He was about to go on when a single shrill wail from just beyond the rain-pattered window brought him to silence. It was almost so faint that he couldn't even hear it, but when the same scream, still muffled by the glass, but clearly closer now, rang through the joint again, he froze. And though he could peer out into the night, he couldn't see anything. Shannon continued to look up at him with bewilderment and lifted both of her hands from her chest, the single silver spoon dangling from between her thumb and fingers like a cigar. He looked from beyond the window back down at her, but couldn't speak. His heart too was thumping in 6/8 time, and he was about to ask her if she had heard it, but already knew her answer, and a quick glance around the place answered the second question on his mind. It's me mummy's recipe," he finished, spitting it out like the plague. He was about to walk away, but his knees grew weak, nearly buckling. So he sat down across from her at the booth and dug the scruff of his chin into his knuckles, which were worn and smelled of Guinness. The pub, which only seconds earlier was cuddled in the warmth of the crackling fire, was now chilled as the night outside, at least to him. Now seated across from the man, Shannon stared the stranger dead in the eyes as she wrote something else on the same dinner napkin, freshly smeared in beer broth and lipstick. "What's wrong?" The gent shook his head and looked around the place. Everyone was going about laughing and drinking and dancing as usual. No one else had heard the scream. "Shite," the gent said, hushed under his intoxicated breath. He turned back to face the woman, but his attention was drawn to the large clump of matted hair floating in her stew. Something beneath it was bubbling, and the once gravy brown colour of the broth was now a deep red that reeked like rusted metal. He was about to gag as the hair began to sink back into the contents of the bowl. And that's when the ghastly white face of a woman emerged from the bubbling broth. Her mouth was wide and filled with the same gurgling suds. She was screaming. The gent was too. From around the pub, several glances were made in the man's direction. However, considering the occasion and the reputation of such a place as the Clangy Clover, a bit of hollering wasn't going to surprise anyone. Aside from maybe a couple of tourists dressed all green and sticking out like a sore thumb in the opposite corner. Men had been killed for wearing such a shade. Another glance down at the bowl and the face was gone, replaced once again with the woman's stew, still steaming. The woman, whom he'd later come to know as Shannon, hadn't noticed the entire ordeal, though her face was flushed off all its once inviting, warm colour as if she had. She was staring out through the hazy window, and if Irish eyes could smile, hers were most definitely shouting. When he saw that awful expression on her face, the gent lightly grasped her shoulder and she jolted at the touch. "Gather yourself," he said. She puffed 4 rapid breaths, coughed into her sleeve and placed a hand over her heart until she calmed. "You alright?" She nodded and grabbed a pen. "There's someone out there." "Who?" He was staring at her like he was shooting darts. She wrote, "A woman." "Was she screaming?" he asked. Shannon swallowed and lifted the pen again, more hesitantly than before. "I don't know." "Why?" the gent asked. "She didn't have a head." The gent combed his scraggly grey hair with his hands, which were now trembling. He reached into his apron pocket again, the same one which housed the little green pen, and pulled out a small bottle of Jameson. He chugged it. Meanwhile, as he did, the woman reached for her spoon. She had well lost her appetite, but she supposed there was some sort of comfort to be found in a hot meal. "Don't," the man said. She couldn't hear him, so he waved his hands at her, and when they locked eyes, he said again, "Don't." She grabbed the napkin. "Why?" "Onion," he croaked, and for a second was relieved by the sound of his own laughter, until it turned into a coughing fit. She wasn't laughing though, and again she lifted the napkin. "Why?" The gent sighed. "Why ya here?" Shannon stared at him silently and then lifted the napkin once more. This time she held it up for longer. "I can read," the man said. "I'll answer that when you answer me. Why ya here?" She took the napkin and, still looking at him, scribbled something. "Looking for someone." The gent attempted to suck whatever he could from the empty Jameson bottle and was only met with the fumes of a liquor ghost. "Who?" She wrote, "Family." "You've got family in the Emerald Isle? Your clan?" She wrote again, this time on the back, since the front was nearly covered. "My parents." "Your parents?" he said, clearing his throat with a chuckle. "What are they doing in Ireland?" She was already answering his question, and as she wrote, she nearly choked on her own spit. She was sick, clearly, and that fair skin of hers, which he assumed was from Irish blood, might have been another telltale sign of that. "That's what I'm trying to find out." The gent nodded and pushed the bowl from between them to the end of the table, glancing out the window again. The rain had stopped, and just before he was about to sigh, a flash of lightning and the immediate crack of thunder rolled through the place. Not that it would shut any of the drunkards up, of course. "You an orphan?" he asked. The woman nodded. "What's your Christian name?" She flipped over the napkin. "Why?" He stared at her. "I just want to know," he finally said. "Then I'll tell you what I know," she wrote. "Shannon." The gent bowed his head, leaned forward, and extended a still trembling hand. "Daniel O'Brien. Call me Danny." She shook it, though somewhat hesitantly, as the man tightly gripped her hand in his. After he rested his arm along the table, he sighed and stroked his chin. "You ever heard of the Banshee?" He took the pen and napkin from her and wrote the word down. Banshee. She shook her head and pointed to the word still scribbled on the sheet, just below his. Why? 'Cause you're fucking arsed, he chuckled, though his voice was robbed of any joy. And again the laughter ended in a harsh swell of hacking. Shannon nodded her head and he continued. The Banshee is an Irish spirit. Me mammy told me the legend when I was a wee little one. She said that the Banshee scream, if you heard it, meant one of your clan was gonna die. Shannon squinted but didn't do anything but sit there. She didn't need to write anything. Her face said it all. I know, Danny said. I know. Stop looking at me like that. Shannon blinked, only once. Danny sighed. Then he laughed. It was a hoarse laugh. I might be a wee bit drunk, he said through parted lips, but I'm not that drunk. There was silence between the two of them again, and now it was Shannon who was staring darts into the eyes of Danny. They were reddened eyes, strained, dilated and bulging with tired veins. He didn't say a word, yet those eyes spoke a million until it was his turn again. How'd you know your parents were in Donnybrook? Shannon turned and peered out the window again, watching as the post-rain fog rolled across the dewy glass. She looked at him and lifted the napkin, pointed to the word he had written, Banshee. We'll get back to her, he nodded, patting the wooden table and still trembling, but calmer than before. Right now, we're talking about you. Still looking dead at him, Shannon slapped something onto the table between them. She lifted the flat palm of her hand and revealed a box of playing cards, inscribed with the name Emerald Isle. He lifted the box just as Shannon began jotting something else. His eyes began to swell as, again, he coughed. But that was not the reason why. On the other side of the little white and green box, a string of letters plainly read, The Almond Printing Company Limited, Dublin, Made in Ireland. Before he could comment, Shannon slid the napkin towards him. It said, This was my father's deck, a full set except for the 3 of clubs. It was made here in Dublin. I'd like to finally meet him and my mother. I'm sick. Danny smiled a shy grin, which was unbefitting of him given his brashness up to that point. He reached into his pocket, not the apron but his actual pants pocket, and pulled something out, smacking it against the table. He sighed, and that timid little smile vanished from his cheeks. He then lifted his trembling hand to reveal the 3 of clubs. Shannon instantly slapped him across the face. It was a knee-jerk reaction and was only followed by a sea of tears flowing out of her eyes. Danny was crying too, but that didn't stop him from speaking his mind, a once again familiar trait, most befitting of him. I deserve that, he said. You didn't, Shanny. Shannon, who was still choked up, pointed at the napkin now soaked in her own tears. The word, running with green ink, still read, Why? I ask myself that every night, Danny said with a sniffle. If I find an answer, I'll tell you. Shannon jotted something, biting her lip. She was afraid of the words she was inscribing into that paper. Where's Mom? All Danny could do was shake his head and she knew right away what he meant. That was the last time I had heard the Banshee. I begged the Lord that I'd never hear her cry again. After a silent moment, which, mind you, was still just as clangy as the clover, he lifted the 3 of clubs and held it tightly between his pinchers. His voice was stronger now. "You ever wonder why it's called the 3 of clubs?" he asked, tapping the shape beneath the number with his finger. "That's a shamrock." Shannon didn't respond. She wanted answers, not more questions. What happened to her mother? Why'd they leave her? Was the Banshee going to kill her? And for some strange reason now, what's with the 3 of clubs? "Pretty funny when something's hidden in plain sight," Danny said, lowering his voice to a whisper, even though that didn't make any difference to his deaf daughter. "In the States, the Yanks call it the lads in black or some shite. Here in Erin, it's the club. Both 'cause of this," he said, tapping the clover shape. "And 'cause if you tell a soul about it, they'll club your ass to death." Shannon shook her head in confusion. Danny looked over to the bearded man playing cards beside the bar, then back to Shannon. "That's Connor Ferguson," he said. "2 of clubs. I'm 3. "We aren't like the Yanks," Danny said, brows furrowed. "'Tisn't a government job. We're like a militia against the fair folk." Shannon shook her head again. She didn't understand. But how could she? Danny pounded the table and held 2 fingers high above his head. Not a moment after did the bearded fella, Connor Ferguson as he called him, clink 2 green beers onto the table. "Who's the last boyo?" Connor Ferguson grinned down at her with a smile. But Shannon wasn't reciprocating it. He swallowed and then turned back to Danny. "Want me to do you in, Danny boy?" Danny shook his head, and Connor, rather confusedly, meandered back to the drunken bunch of gamblers while whistling Danny boy to himself, taking one last glance over his shoulder at Shannon. His eyes looked familiar, perhaps from a memory. "Your mother, God rest her soul, started this place 35 years ago today. Connor was here from the very beginning," Danny said. Shannon continued to wear her confused expression, and Danny chuckled. "What? You think I dreamed of being a barter? Not much bartering to do when you're protecting your clan from the fair folk." Shannon grabbed a napkin and pen and began scribbling again. Danny tapped it and caught her attention. He pointed to the beer before her. "You better drink up," he smiled. Shannon continued writing. "Who are the fair folk?" "Feckin' Yanks," Danny muttered under his breath. "Fair folk are the Fae, the fairies." Shannon's eyes lit up. "Yeah, you read me lips right. But they ain't feckin' Tinkerbell, Shanny. They are bogarts, goblins, and your banshees. Now, not all of them is bad. Hell, take our banshee out there, for example," he said, pointing to the window. "She's what we call an omen. She only tells you it as it is. Every clan has one. That's why, when you saw her, I knew you was me own flesh and blood. That's why no one else seen nor heard her cry." Shannon swallowed toughly. It was a hard pill, after all. "I know you don't want to believe me. Believe me, I know. But your mother and I did what we did to protect you." Danny's lip quivered and he bowed his head. When she told me about you listening, he said, pointing to his ear, I thought Lady Luck had stopped smiling on us. We were young and we were scared. I thought your deaf ears were a curse. Shannon interrupted him and bitterly wrote, ripping a napkin some in the process. They are. Danny shook his head. You were our greatest blessing, Shanny. Our greatest blessing. I'm sorry we were too blind to see it then, but I see it now. Danny's speech was interrupted by another high-pitched howl from outside. It was even closer than before, as if the thing's lips were now pressed against the window's foggy glass. He didn't look. He faced forward, and as he stared at his teary-eyed daughter, she coughed again. Only once, but she coughed hard enough to spit blood onto her sleeve. She wiped it with a napkin. At that moment, Danny's Irish blood ran icier than it ever had, and immediately he reached out with his old and cold hands and embraced hers. They were cold too, but full of life. Is it bad? He asked. Shannon nodded without looking up at him, and Danny muttered something softly to himself. Perhaps a prayer or plea, either to God or the God-forsaken Banshee, and scooted up in the booth until his gut was pressed against the table. He smiled, but now there was joy in his demeanour. I remember when you was 3, he said, his eyes glowing like emeralds. And all you wanted was a unicorn, he chuckled. Your mother told you there was no such thing, he said, reaching into his other pants pocket. But she was talking a load of blarney. Danny lifted his hand and placed a large golden horseshoe smack dab between them on the table. Shannon stared down at it with bewildered eyes. I got this from Scotland. I carry it round with me as a sign of good luck. Danny winked. But it was always meant for you, Shanny. Shannon lifted it to her watery eyes. It was heavy and it glimmered louder than the fire. Before she could thank him, Danny had already placed another trinket on the table. This is me die, he said, lifting his fingers and nudging a tiny white cube dotted with 6 black dots atop it, towards his daughter. It was with that die that I won your mother, he smiled, shrugging. Well, not won, but, well, you know, we were both playing craps for shite. And I tell her, let's go. And we did. And that's how you came along. Shannon nodded and picked up the die, rolling it around in the fingers of her hand, holding up the golden horseshoe with the other. Danny, who had grown more sombre within an instant, held out his final charm. This one's the most special, Danny said, lifting up a 3-leaf clover, a shamrock which was creased and wrinkled up and had clearly seen sunnier days. Most fucking idiots will tell you the 4-leafers are the lucky ones, but they are wrong, Shanny. He held out the tiny green plant and pointed to one of its droopy petals. Father, Son, Holy Ghost, he said, extending it to her. Patrick rid the Emerald Isle of serpents, and God willing, we'll keep the other devils out. Shannon took the shamrock in her palm and looked up at her father as a single tear caressed the heat of her face. Danny smiled a toothy grin, and for the last time whooped a final bellowing cough from his lungs. He glanced over to the window and noticed the glaring white face of the woman, the same one from the stew, staring back at him. But the Banshee wasn't screaming. Not anymore. Danny looked back over to his daughter, pushed the lonesome 3 of clubs towards her from his side of the table and said tenderly and hushed, Good luck, Shani. And with that, he keeled over on the table and died. And I hope you enjoy the blooper reel. That fire had caught her attention with all its crackling and popping like a tiny fireworks show, and she didn't look up at him until the menu and napkins slid across the table. The fire had caught her attention with all this crackling and popping. Fuck's sake. He said it like a tourist trying to talk to Nate. He looked from beyond the window back down at her. He looked from the window, for fuck's sake. Though her face was flushed. Though her face was flushed off all its once living. She was already answering his question as she wrote. Not a moment after did the bearded fella he'll take our Banshee out there for shut up. Shannon interrupted him and bitterly wrote. It was the last time we'd ever seen you. It was the last week we'd ever seen you. And you're Danny, who had grown more so. Hey family, please be so kind as to punch the like button and smack the arse of the subscription button as well. And remember to chokehold that notification bell and then select all. That way you'll receive all notifications each time I upload a new video. And by subscribing, you'll be the first to see all of our new spooky creepypasta stories. A very big thank you to MakRalston for allowing me to narrate this awesome story. And make sure to check out their Creepypasta fandom page for more brilliant stories. Be sure to go check out his book. And why not, hashtag Cryptids Roost in your comments. A quick thank you to all my Cryptids Roost community family too. We are now well on our journey to 1,000 subscribers. If you would like to support us and throw me $1 or $3, I'd be very much appreciative. I do have PayPal, paypal.me/cryptidsroost. Alternatively, I have an account at buymeacoffee.com. You don't even need to register on either site to donate. I have a subreddit if you have a story you've written that you would like me to narrate for you. You can also follow us. All my socials are contained within the Linktree link below. And don't forget to check out the end screen. See above. That will also list some more videos in my back catalogue. All the links are below. Take care everyone, and I hope you all have a wonderful and peaceful night. And don't forget, where fear is, happiness is.